So the emergence of biology from the 18th century onwards and from genetics in the 19th and 20th century onwards actually was a deeply pernicious history, because both of those academic fields of study, which are now the biggest fields of study in all of academia, in all of science, were invented not in parallel with political ideologies, but in service of those political ideologies.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Edinburgh International Book Festival. Very pleased to have you here with us tonight. My name is Dr. Gwinnetta Curry, and I first would like to thank our sponsor, the Scottish Mortgage Investment Trust, for sponsoring this event tonight. And today we have with us Dr. Adam Rutherford, who wrote this amazing book called Control: The Dark History and the Troubling Present of Eugenics. First, let's do some housekeeping. If everyone could please turn off their phones or turn it on silent, and if you are tweeting about this event tonight, please do so without bothering your neighbor. Yes, so we're gonna have a brief introduction, and then Adam is gonna give us a brief spiel, and we'll have a conversation and give questions from the audience as well as online, and there will be a book signing just after this, okay?
Why would any of you come on a Saturday night to hear about the history of eugenics and genocide? Because that's what we're going to be talking. I mean, there's like pubs. There's a festival on, I think.
So much going on.
I know.
They just wanted to see you.
I mean, you can just lock. Can you lock the doors?
Excellent. All right, so in this book...
I meant thank you for coming.
Yes, of course. Thank you for coming to spend time with us. Yeah. But also, there's nothing else to do. Right? Yeah. All right, so, I teach in the College of Medicine, and so looking at the dodgy history of race and medicine, I'm from the US if you haven't gathered from my accent, this book was very interesting. And looking at the connection of eugenics, as well as from the US to the UK, all the way across into multiple countries, and really understanding that history and what it has to do with what's happening now. A lot of times when we think about eugenics, we only think about it from a historical standpoint and that it has nothing to do with now. A lot of the conversations I have with my students are about the history of medicine and race, and it's easy to discount it to yesteryear and nothing to do with the present. In this book, Adam did an amazing job of showing how history has a direct impact on what we're doing today. I'll pass it over to Adam.
Yeah, well, thank you. That's exactly right. I mean, I'm a geneticist, right? I'm a scientist. I'm a lecturer at UCL, and I've been studying genetics now since I was 18 or 19. And I've ended up being a sort of historian of biology and of science more broadly. And there's a very specific reason for that, which is that, one of my earlier books, which was called A Brief History of Everyone Who Ever Lived, which dealt with the idea that DNA and genetics had become this new sort of source text, a historical source text that we could assess the history of evolution of all species, but also particularly of human history. And it's only been accessible to us for the last 10 years or so. So in that book, it was a great sort of celebration of this recent history of genetics, which makes it the most interesting branch of biology and therefore of science. But one of the chapters in there was dedicated to looking at the history of my field, because it is a very pernicious history. Genetics is only a century old in any real term, and since the Human Genome Project was nominally completed in 2001, that was the benchmark of when we began to do 21st century genetics and have a really sophisticated understanding of how DNA works and how it converts into behavior. But of course, what is genetics but the study of families and sex and people? And we've been studying those things for thousands of years. So the emergence of biology from the 18th century onwards and from genetics in the 19th and 20th century onwards actually was a deeply pernicious history, because both of those academic fields of study, which are now the biggest fields of study in all of academia, in all of science, were invented not in parallel with political ideologies, but in service of those political ideologies. So race science was invented in the 18th, 17th, 18th centuries in order to bolster European expansion, colonialization. And similarly, genetics emerged out of a desire to reshape populations and the structure of populations in Victorian Britain primarily, and then very quickly spread all around Europe and the rest of the world. But genetics emerged out of eugenics, because eugenics was the scientification of a very long-standing idea, which is effectively the powerful people deciding who gets to mate, who gets to reproduce. And it's an old idea. The earliest references come from classical texts. Plato talks about eugenics type ideas in Republic, in books 5 and 6 of Republic, and they're very clear indications that society will degrade unless high-quality people are matched. He proposed marriage ceremonies, festivals where gold standard women would be matched with gold standard men, and they would have gold standard children. And the same with bronze, and they would be the lower class of people as a result of those pairings would be taken away and removed from society. And that never happened, of course. It was a sort of utopian fantasy, but Plutarch wrote about the Spartan eugenics policies. We don't really know whether they happened or not, because there's only one report of them. But that's where babies deemed unworthy or deformed would be thrown off Mount Tegetos into the apothetai, which is the pit or the deposit. And we don't know whether that happened, but then Seneca writes about killing disabled babies at birth, drowning them, and we do think that definitely happened. So basically, you've got this idea of population control through birth control in its literal sense rather than in its modern sense, has existed in pretty much every culture that we've looked at for the whole of human history. But what happened in the 19th century, in the years, a decade after Darwin published The Origin of Species, his cousin, his half-cousin, in fact, Francis Galton, who was a brilliant scientist, a genius in so many ways, but also a profoundly racist white supremacist, figured that if humans are evolved and subject to natural selection and artificial selection, which is what the first chapter of The Origin of Species is about, then why shouldn't we apply the same principles to humans to improve the stock of the British people that we do to cattle or sheep, that we've been doing for thousands of years? And thus was born, and he coined the word eugenics, but thus was born the scientification of an older idea. And the sort of political, social climate that it emerges into is one of Victorian turmoil, expanded urbanization as a result of the Industrial Revolution, immigrants coming in from the expanding colonies, the British having their asses repeatedly handed to them by what they deemed to be lower people, lower quality people. The Boer War in the 1890s was a really good example of that, and was a big sort of fillet for the eugenics movement. So it became enormously popular very quickly. After 1883, Galton comes up with the word eugenics, meaning well-born, as a positive idea that we should improve the quality of the people through selective breeding. And it just took off. One of the things I try to do in the first half of the book is chart the pathway from a pretty esoteric academic idea that this relatively obscure scientist or pseudoscientist came up with in the 1870s, and how that led to, directly to the gates of Auschwitz, where eugenics became a central pillar of the Third Reich, but also in America, which I think is arguably the second most enthusiastic adopter, other than Nazi Germany, of eugenics. 31 states over the course of the 20th century had official eugenics policies on their books. We estimate up to 80,000 men and women were sterilized against their will or knowledge during the course of the 20th century. So that's, and as you said at the beginning, right, most people associate the idea of eugenics with the atrocities of the Nazis, and then it all ends. You know, the Second World War ends, we see the true effects of the Holocaust, and eugenics becomes, it switches, not overnight, but in a very short space of time, from being universally supported across the political spectrum, both left and right, to being universally revered as a toxic idea that it is now. But it didn't go away. It didn't go away at all. I know you know the answer to this, but when do you think the last involuntary sterilization occurred in, I don't know, pick a state, California? Someone said 1960. It was last year.
Last year.
Yeah. In the ICE detention centers, we estimate up to 30 women were sterilized against their knowledge or will. So it's much significantly smaller numbers. There's an ongoing class action of First Nations women in Canada, more than 200 of them, who were sterilized against their knowledge or will in the last 10 years or so. So the legacy of this idea is very much in our present. And then, I'm sorry, I'm just talking now. Maybe you should ask me a question.
No, I'll add in that there's also this documentary, No Mas Bebés, about the Latino women in California who were also sterilized against their will. They gave them consent forms in English, right, in a language they didn't know, while they were in labor, and had them sign. They would ask them questions, oh, would you like for me to take the pain away? Just sign here. And they didn't know they were signing off to be sterilized, right? And this is not in the, the early days. This is within the last 10 years, right? And so, to drive that point home, is still something that's a problem today. I wanted to read this bit here on page 67 from Charles Davenport. It said, new blood will make the American population darker in pigmentation, smaller in stature, more given to crimes of larceny, kidnapping, assault, murder, rape, and sex immorality. Right? I thought that point was very important because it's what they thought would happen if you had more babies from these, lower populations, right?
Yeah.
And I wanted to dig into some of that thought because, of course, this was a quote from a long time ago.
Yeah.
But what do we think about today and the rise of issues around immigration, even here in the UK?
Yeah. So Charles Davenport was the American equivalent of Francis Galton. He met him in the 1890s and then devoted the rest of his life to being the cheerleader, the head of the American eugenics movement, and very effectively because they did have legislation in the majority of states for the majority of the 20th century. He was a geneticist, he was a biologist, and he adopted, so you remember at school you learned about Mendel and his peas? Yes? Nod enthusiastically. And with that, the Mendelian rules of genetics were determined by Mendel, this Moravian monk. And he effectively came up with the concept of the gene because he saw that there were units of inheritance that were passed from generation to generation in a discrete way. And with those patterns, you could predict whether, with great statistical accuracy, whether a pea has wrinkly skin or smooth skin, or is a pink flower or a purple flower. And Mendelian genetics is a sort of cornerstone of how genetics works. But we're not peas. And the overinterpretation of Mendelian genetics at the beginning of the 20th century, when it was rediscovered, his work was rediscovered in 1900 in Western Europe and America, was something that gave a huge boost to this nascent eugenics movement, particularly with Davenport, because he figured that every characteristic was encoded by a single gene, just as in peas, and we could track the pathway of diseases or traits through families if you just had a family tree big enough. And that is how we do a lot of genetics. That is how we determine the inheritance pattern for cystic fibrosis or Duchenne muscular dystrophy or Huntington's, which was first described by Charles Davenport, or eye color, which we learn as 16-year-olds in school, that you have a gene, one variant of which encodes brown eyes, and one variant of which encodes blue eyes, but you need 2 versions of the blue-eyed gene in order to have blue eyes, but only one of the brown because it's dominant, right? All Mendelian roles. That, by the way, is not true, okay? That is something we teach to children to simplify genetics, and then we latch onto it. It is perfectly possible for parents of any eye color to have children with any eye color, and you cannot predict with any accuracy what color eyes your children will have based on the genes that they have. Anyway, that was a little bit of a side rant. But Davenport was, so he came up with these ideas of traits, of complex traits, which include pigmentation and particular diseases, particular diseases associated with disabilities. But also, and this happens every time there is eugenics in any country or wherever it's discussed, it starts off with being, these are diseases that need to be eradicated, but very rapidly becomes, these are also diseases that need to be eradicated, but they're socially constructed diseases, or things like epilepsy, or menstrual troubles in women, or alcoholism. And then it becomes the Irish, and then it's always the Jews. And what we see when eugenics is embraced is always this very rapid, if you're going to have people at the top of society, you have to have people below them, and the list of people below them always ends up with being everyone who isn't us, right? So it's a political ideology which is a maintenance of hegemonic power structures. And what Davenport was doing in that quote was something which is as old as time, which was expressing the concept of declinism. Everything was better in the past, everything is wrong today, and we can mostly attribute why everything is going wrong to the influx of immigrants, or that working class people, or degenerate people as they determined it, were having too many children, whereas the middle classes and the upper classes were not having enough children. And this is heavily influenced by that current understanding of classical civilizations, the concept of the fall of Rome, which was that the Roman decadent upper classes weren't having enough babies, but the people from the East were having too many. And it's a continual threat throughout history. Plato talks about it, Gibbon talks about it in The Decline and Fall, Davenport's talking about it there. It becomes formalized in 1918 as declinism by a German writer called Spengler. And, oh yeah, this is my absolute favorite bit of writing this book. Who's read The Great Gatsby in this room? Everyone's read The Great Gatsby, of course, because it is the great American novel and maybe the best novel ever. Who spotted that on page 4, the concept of eugenics is mentioned explicitly and runs as a theme throughout the book, with great replacement theory being described verbatim by Tom Buchanan. No, I didn't spot it either in the 8 times I'd read it since I was 16. And then, oh, there's one person's got his hand up there. Well done, you. But yeah, Buchanan talks about how the white race will be extinguished if we don't have enough children. He says it's science, it's all been proven. Well, it hasn't been proven, and it isn't science. And it's the same thing that is expressed throughout history and is expressed today when we talk about great replacement theory, which was formulated in the 20th century, but is a big part of the current conversations about race, particularly in America. And it's one of those huge sort of phantom menaces that exist throughout history and never comes to pass, weirdly. But it's such a potent, emotive threat that it becomes the driving force behind some of the most pernicious policies in history, and is very much part of our present.
Absolutely. I want to discuss another part of the book where you talked about Margaret Sanger's influence with eugenics. Now, Margaret Sanger is a person most people connect to birth control, but not so much eugenics. Would you tell us about more about that connection, and as well as how Hitler actually got his methods from the U.S. through the eugenics?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mentioned that eugenics in the 1910s and 20s had sort of bipartisan support across the political spectrum, and I think that's people often find that surprising because it's normally associated with extreme right-wing political sensibilities or fascism, and associated with the Nazis. But the fact of the matter is that socialists and left-leaning people were also profoundly supportive of eugenic ideology. People like William Beveridge expressed great positivity about eugenics throughout his career. George Bernard Shaw. H.G. Wells sort of vacillated from week to week on whether he liked eugenics or not, so he's not a great example. Churchill was the biggest supporter, the most enthusiastic political supporter of eugenics in this country. But also, to talk about Sanger, I'm going to keep it local. First wave feminism was very invested in eugenic ideology as well. And in this country, it was Mary Stopes. Mary Stopes, who we associate with Mary Stopes clinics and providing reproductive rights and abortions to tens of thousands of women around the world. Mary Stopes was a horror, a profoundly anti-Semitic racist who was mostly interested in developing birth control and reproductive rights so that the Irish could be exterminated and expelled from London, but not just the Irish, also, of course, the Jews and Slavs. She wrote poetry. She wrote a book of love poetry, which included just shockingly racist rhymes. I don't know why I'm laughing about this, it's awful. And she sent it in 1938 to Hitler. A book of love poetry with a letter saying, "Love is the greatest thing, please distribute this amongst your youth," to show how love can conquer all, whilst I think I do quote it in the book. She rhymes Russians with, she says something like, the Jews are a curse, but the Russians are worse. Yeah. Anyway, so first wave feminism, very invested in eugenics types ideas. In America, Margaret Sanger is the sort of equivalent of Mary Stopes.
Yes.
Founder of what becomes Planned Parenthood, and she also expressed very similar ideas about restricting the reproductive rights of women in certain groups in society. And I say that tentatively because I think that there is, what you see when you study eugenics around the world, you see similar but different patterns of behavior everywhere. So in the UK, we have a less racially or in the 1900s, early 20th century, we had a less racially stratified society, but more class-based. Eugenics is a lot less focused on race as we see it today, whereas in America, which is a racist country built on the backs of the enslaved, where racial stratification is the sort of dominant. I'm saying this to a black American woman, so I feel like you should be saying this.
Perfectly fine.
Okay. Where eugenics policies were always targeted against indigenous Americans and descendants of the enslaved more than any other category of people. And we were just talking about this backstage. One of the things that's really fascinating, which I talk about just in a little bit, is Sanger was good friends with W.E.B. Du Bois, the great African-American scholar of the 20th century. And she influenced his thinking to the extent that he expressed some pretty pro-eugenics ideas, which you think, this is crazy. You're the most marginalized group of people, and you're suggesting that eugenics policies might help African Americans through what he was describing as racial uplift by selective breeding of the. Well, you say you know this much better than I.
So Du Bois, I wouldn't say he was a supporter of eugenics, but he was very much into racial uplift and making sure that he felt that those who were in poverty, right, needed some structure. I would say it was more of a classist thing. So the impoverished community, he felt, not necessarily didn't deserve to procreate, but exactly needed more resources in that sense, right? I wouldn't say that he fed into the same racist notion as Margaret Sanger, because Margaret Sanger was very clear about preventing feeble-mindedness and things, and she changed her language from focusing on, because she actually used the word like Negro, and now she changed, not now, but throughout, she changed the language to preventing feeble-mindedness, right? And so that became code for for Black Americans, right, to prevent the procreation of poor Blacks. And I think that for Du Bois's work, because he did a lot of work on the Philadelphia Project and throughout the US, really talk about the challenges and socioeconomic issues within the Black community. And he felt that if everyone had the same opportunities and resources, that yes, they could be uplifted and be as successful as their white counterparts, right? So those challenges were more economically driven, not so much as this racist notion of you don't deserve to procreate, right? I think those are the challenges there. I think sometimes when we use Du Bois's work, it can be complicated. Now, he's seen as like the father of sociology, right? But a lot of people ignore his contributions for that. It was a book that came out, Alton Morris's book that talked about this, but he was very clear. It's not that he agreed with Margaret Sanger's approach, but it was that impoverished communities, Black impoverished communities, needed the resources to be able to uplift themselves, right?
Yeah. Yeah, so that was a much better answer than the one I was given. When you were talking about it, I was thinking about how one of the things that Du Bois was involved in his magazine, which was called The Crisis.
The Crisis, yep.
Was he introduced better baby competitions. So you'd take a photo of your baby and enter it, and they'd judge the best African-American babies. And that was something which was specifically done as part of the eugenics movement in rural America. There was a sense that eugenics was a sort of top-down governmental or scientists telling working class people how to behave. And they recognized this, and Davenport was the head of the Eugenics Records Office in Cold Spring Harbor, and he recognized this and did something which was very clever politically, which was to send out teams of people, mostly women, to rural communities in places like Iowa and Kansas, to agricultural fairs. And there they would run better baby contests or fitter family contests, and would say, whilst you guys are breeding your Frisians and blackfaces and whatever the animals they were breeding, that we should also be breeding the Joneses and the Smiths. This was part of the normalization of eugenics across the states, particularly in agricultural areas. I think, although I'm not sure, that is the reason why California, that's one of the reasons why California was the most enthusiastic adopter of eugenics. So half of people sterilized against their knowledge or will in the 20th century occurred in California, that famously liberal state. But what a lot of people don't remember is that California is a huge agricultural community. It produces the majority of wheat and grain for America. But what Davenport was actually doing in those fitter family contests was harvesting data. He was harvesting family trees to take back to the Eugenics Records Office, because if he had a family tree, a pedigree for the whole of the American people, then you could identify the pathway through the generations of particular traits or diseases, and therefore have a pseudoscientific framework on which you could pivot or leverage eugenics ideas. And they did that very successfully. The link with Nazi Germany, which follows on directly from that, is fascinating and was a bit of a surprise to me. I sort of had an idea about this, but then really getting stuck into it. So Davenport's deputy was a guy called Harry Laughlin, also a biologist, a geneticist from Yale. And he recognized in 1919, 1920, that states were beginning to adopt eugenics policies and legislation, but they were doing it in a sort of ad hoc way, because there wasn't a standardized, there wasn't a boilerplate legal structure for imposing these sterilization laws. So he constructed it and published it in a book, and it helped a lot of states. They just took it as a template and then signed off on the legislation much more easily. Now, that was in 1920. In Germany, eugenics had been developing in a similar sort of pathway from the 1890s onwards, led by a guy called Alfred Plötz, who also had met Galton in the 1890s and devoted the rest of his life to promoting eugenics in Germany. And and his eugenics was mostly focused on Nordic purity, which becomes Aryan purity during the Third Reich from the 30s onwards. But you see a similar but different pattern of behavior in Germany. So Nordic purity is the driving force behind the German eugenicists. Many of them in the 20s were not anti-Semitic and actually recognized that the perceived success of Ashkenazi Jewish people in European society meant that Aryan or Nordic people should have children with Ashkenazi Jews in order to protect their Nordic purity. It was only really in 1933 when Hitler seized power and his virulent anti-Semitism that many of the German eugenicists then adopted the anti-Semitism that came with it because they thought this was the best way to get their eugenics policies through. Anyway, the link is that all the way through the 20s and into the 30s, German academics and scientists and doctors particularly were communicating very directly with Davenport's eugenicists in Cold Spring Harbor and were funded by the Rockefeller Foundation.
Absolutely.
The two eugenics institutes in Berlin until 1938 were funded by the Rockefellers because it was seen as a positive thing. And they pulled funding when the full extent of the policies of the Nazis were becoming apparent and it looked like we were heading towards war. But Davenport was out in Germany teaching, so was Lachlan, so were other people who were involved in American eugenics. It was funded by Americans, and the first law, not the first, it's the third law that Hitler passes in 1933, is the first of the Nazi eugenics laws. And guess what they wrote it with? It was translated from Harry Lachlan's 1920 template. So the German eugenics was intellectually, scientifically, legally, and financially funded and influenced by the American eugenics policy. Mm-hmm. This is not to exonerate the British at all, because we kind of came up with it as an idea, but we never had policy in this country, mostly, so Churchill was campaigning for it until about 1912, when he became distracted and stopped thinking about it. But it was the reason we didn't have enforced sterilization on our legislative books was mostly due to the campaigning work of G.K. Chesterton, which is a kind of weird thing to say, but it's true. He was a lifelong opponent of eugenics because I think he accurately identified what the people who were targeted by eugenics policies fell into numerous different categories that were either racially stratified or pseudo-psychiatric or pseudo-medical or whatever. But he identified, I think accurately, that what they really were was poor, right? And that eugenics targets the poor. And he was a Orthodox, strict Catholic, and he felt that ran against his religious sensibilities. He campaigned to one particular MP, Josiah Wedgwood, of the Wedgwood clan, so also of the Darwin clan as well. And Wedgwood successfully removed enforced sterilization from the Mental Deficiencies Bill, which was passed in 1913. So I liken this to a lot of sort of British colonial activity like cricket. We invent these things and then we farm them out to the rest of the world and we turn out to be shit at them.
That's one way to put it.
Yeah. There's not a lot of laughs in this talk, are there?
Well, I teach health disparities, and I'm always excited about it. And they're like, Dr. Curry, because it's death, it's dark. But it's an important history that, people need to grapple with. I wanted to bring it to the present. Yeah. So throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, the various sentiments of eugenics and genetics have been a part of the conversation. When resources were low, it was a conversation about, okay, who do we treat in this moment? Do we give resources to this person with said disability or not? Do we just focus on the healthy population, like disposable populations they see? What do you think in terms of, in the book you say, scientists go from working in their labs and doing this research, it becomes this idea, then it turned to genocide. What do you think in the terms of COVID, where you had scientists at the forefront influencing policy, which actually, I mean, in my opinion, I guess I'm biased, like helped, with, not only vaccinations, but also different things to kind of curb the impact of COVID. Like, how do you see this relationship between the scientists and, governmental policies?
Yeah. I mean, it's a difficult question, and it's an important one too. I mean, just during COVID in this country. No, I'm sorry, I'm not in this country. In England. I forgot where I was for a second there. But Edinburgh's kind of like England. Oh no.
No, you cannot.
I did that deliberately. This was like that time when I was at the Glasgow Literary Festival, and I was talking about something completely different, which is about ancestry and genetics, and I told them quite confidently that there isn't really such a thing as being a Celt. I mean, it's just a made-up Victorian category, Celtic. It doesn't genetically. It means nothing whatsoever. It's a tricky escape from that lecture theatre. Anyway, sorry. How to win over your audience. Do not resuscitate notices were being put on people with Down syndrome in hospitals, which is shocking.
Yeah.
I mean, utterly shocking that should happen, and that's a very eugenicsy type behavior. I started by saying I'm a geneticist, right? And I've ended up being a sort of historian of biology because of something that I think emerges from looking at the history of my field, this field that I've devoted my life to, which I love. Most biologists do not go into research in order to learn the pernicious history of their field. But that is inevitably what has happened. If you write about race science, if you write about genetics, you discover that, well, two things. One, it has a pernicious history, and secondly, the legacy of that history, of those histories, is very much part of our present today. Science is structurally racist in the same way that the rest of society is. But there are sort of specific categories of structural racism which are the legacy of scientific racism within our fields, particularly within biology and genetics because of its peculiar history. Oh, and I should also point out as well that this is very much my history because I'm at UCL. I've been at UCL since I was 18. When I went up to UCL to study genetics under Steve Jones, that was in the Galton laboratory. I was taught by the Galton professor in the Galton lecture theatre. And we did teach that history, right? I learned that as an undergraduate. I now teach that course to undergraduates. It all happened at UCL. And one of the things I discovered in the last few years is that history that we thought we knew inside out didn't really spill over into the rest of UCL, let alone other universities in Europe or the rest of the world. And I'm very glad that the conversations, so in the last couple of years, I get invitations from all over the world to talk about the history of eugenics from geneticists. Now, I think it's really, really important that we know our own history because of, and this is the sort of long answer to your question, because we think of science, we like to think of science as being apolitical and amoral, and that we're just generating data. And it is up to, grubby politicians or journalists or society more broadly to interpret the data that we generate in this absolutely pristine, neutral way, right? That is just not true. It's not true at all. All science is political. All science has always been political. Anyone who says that science isn't political has not been paying attention for about 500 years. Race science and eugenics are two really good examples of this. Sometimes when I say this in front of physicists, they say, well, I'm counting stars in distant galaxies. That is definitely less political. I will concede that point. But I think it's really important that the principles of science, the aim, the goal, is that it should be outside of the grubby world of politics. But that is unachievable. And if we don't know our own history, we're absolutely doomed to repeat it, as the saying goes. So I do get a lot of pushback from scientists saying, well, I'm not engaged in a political, there isn't a political valence to my work. But genetics is a really good example of how even people who are well-intentioned can be unaware of the fact that data is never neutral and science is always political. I'll just tell you a quick thing. So, Human Genome Project wrapped up in about 2000, 2001. In 2005, as a sort of direct result of it, we invented a new technique which was called the genome-wide association study. And it totally revolutionized how we do genetics. Basically, the difference was, in the olden days, by which I mean the 1990s, I told you it's a young field, right? You'd look for specific genes, right? So you'd try and identify, you'd get a family which had a disease, an inherited disease running through it, and you'd try and focus in first on a chromosome, well, first on individuals in the family, you look at the inheritance pattern, then into a chromosome, and then you'd walk down and get closer and closer until you found the actual gene that was defective and was causing, you know, whatever. Cystic fibrosis is one of the classic examples, because it was one of the first ones we cracked in 1986, that was. But that's a slow and cumbersome process. So the genome-wide association study was a much more efficient way, but it was absolutely reliant on having lots of people's genomes. So what you do instead is you take 1,000 people, or as many people as you can get hold of, and look to see if they had something in common with each other, such as a specific disease or a specific type of behavior. And then you'd look at all of their genomes together and look at the bits that were statistically significantly similar in those people compared to people who didn't have that characteristic. And it totally revolutionized how we do genetics. And it's a brilliant and valid tool that is used all of the time. Do you remember in the 2010s, there were headlines every week which were, scientists discover the gene for something, right? Now, there aren't any genes for anything, right? Human genetics is much more complex than that, and it's a deeply, it's a sort of pernicious way that we teach genetics, is that we talk about genes for things. There are genes associated with particular behaviors and phenotypes and so on. But the point I'm struggling to get to is that when we first started doing genome-wide association studies in the 2005-ish, about 90% of the genomes available to us came from white European people, because most of the work had been done in Western Europe and America. And that's deeply unrepresentative of genomic diversity in the rest of the world, right? White European people are a statistical outlier in terms of genome diversity, and almost all genetic diversity in humans resides within people of recent African descent, either in Africa at the moment or from the various diasporas over the last few centuries. So if you're only looking at white European genomes, you're really only addressing a tiny proportion of genomic diversity and only really serving a tiny proportion of humanity. That was in 2005, and we know this is a problem. The last time it was assessed, which was last year, the proportion of genomes available for genome-wide association study databases was now 92% white Europeans. So we've actually gone in the wrong direction. So you tell geneticists that, and they go, "Oh, I didn't know that." Or UK Biobank, which is an amazing resource, is heavily stratified and heavily biased towards particular demographic groups. Now, there are understandable reasons for that, which are both practical but also reflect sort of structural racisms in society. But I think the most, and I'm not criticizing these databases, but we have to recognize that those biases are in the data, and that you can't go out and publish a paper which says, this genome-wide association study says this, when actually what you need to say is, it says this about a tiny proportion of people. And this is a real problem in biology more broadly, because if we're developing drugs off the back of that data, they may not work for the majority of human beings. There's another little anecdote which I'll tell you, which is unrelated to eugenics, but shows another structural bias in biology, which is that when drugs started to be tested in the 1920s on mice, one of the standard model animals that we use to test drugs, it was very quickly recognized that because female mice have menstrual cycles. This has a confounding effect on experimentation or drug testing or whatever. So it meant that female mice are much more expensive to keep. So they didn't test them on female mice. And so the legacy of that, I mean, we have fixed that to a certain degree in the modern era. But the legacy of that is that for most of the 20th century, drugs were not tested on 51% of humans. So we don't actually know whether loads of drugs work for the majority of humans, that is, women. Cool. Well done, science.
Yes, science, they do have a long way to go to fill these gaps and to gain trust in various communities to participate.
But I think, like, knowing you've got a problem, like a proper alcoholic, knowing you've got a problem is the first step.
Yes.
And that's what I'm doing.
Excellent job.
Thanks.
Thank you. We're going to take some questions from the audience for the last 12 minutes. So there should be a microphone. And just raise your hand. Yep, here.
Hello.
Hi.
Given the current political climate, do you think there's a real risk that individuals' genetic information or genetic markers for disease can be sort of commodified and used by maybe health insurance companies, especially if we're going more into private healthcare maybe, or employers, the data's being sold, or even the benefit system? Do you think that could be used against individuals or not? Or do you think that's more sort of paranoia and fantasy book?
I don't think it's paranoia. I think it's a perfectly reasonable question, but there is almost universal legislation to prevent that from happening, which is almost universally enforced. So insurers are not allowed to use genetic information. There's a different version of that story, which I think is interesting, which is when we volunteer our own genetic information into either private companies or the public domain, which I do think is deeply worrying. Hands up, who in this room has done a 23andMe test? Well, not too many.
About 5.
Okay. 23andMe was set up by the then wife of one of the founders of Google. And you know how Google makes its money not by being a search engine, but by being the curator of the world's information. Yes? That's its business model. Its stated aim. Well, funnily enough, 23andMe was set up with exactly the same stated aim. This is not me being conspiracy theory-ish. This was declared by their board in like 2014. What 23andMe's aim was to curate the richest data set that is known in the universe, which is the human genome. So if they could get hold of your genomes, then you have this incredibly rich database of human genomes on which you can do things like develop drugs, right? So, but the trick, the brilliant, the genius trick was that in exchange for something which I think is scientifically meaningless, a trinket, you pay to give your most private data to a company which then sells it on to develop drugs that you then pay for. It's amazing. It's an amazing system. It's impressive. I actually find it impressive at how cleverly structured that is. And we pay. We are not your clients. You're not customers. That's what they want from you, and that's what they get from you. And I should also say that this brilliant system was invented by Francis Galton, who did exactly that in 1884 when he recognized that big data sets for biometric markers were going to be important for his work in eugenics. So he set up at the World Hygiene Fair down in South Kensington in London, he set up a little a sort of stall, a tent, in which people paid 3 pence to have 11 things measured: punch strength, height, weight, eyesight, visual acuity, blah, blah, blah. And at the end of it, they get a little card, and they went home happy that they'd been measured by scientists. They were carbon copied. He took the data away, and with that developed most statistical techniques that we use today. So exactly the same model. People paid to give their data away. 9,039 people did that in a week.
All right, I'm going to take one question from online first, and then we'll go with the hand in the back. Yep.
I'll try and give shorter answers. I famously give long answers.
The first question from online is, what is the relationship between eugenics and euthanasia? These days, are they imposed directly, overtly, or do they happen more often undercover by conscious omission, mass denial, or cast in the gaze of positive choice?
What was the first sentence?
What's the relationship between eugenics and euthanasia?
Eugenics and euthanasia?
Yeah.
You know what? I don't know anything about it, so I'm going to pass. I'm not going to bullshit my way out of that. Sorry, online person. I don't know anything about euthanasia.
Okay. Fair.
Scientists should always say, I don't know.
And I think that's okay. I think you should be able to say that. That's important. Question in the back?
My question has to do with the theories of polygenism as supported by Josiah Nod and Morton and others, and how that in general seems to support this idea of eugenics in the 20th century. Say
the first bit again.
Polygenism, chronology, multiple races, and a certain hierarchy that is established that was much in conflict with Darwin during the mid-19th century.
Yeah, okay. So in the 18th century, there were two competing ideas about, I go back up a little bit. This is actually from my previous book. So the answer to this question is in How to Argue with a Racist, which is also available in all good bookshops. But the invention of racial categories, which starts with Linnaeus in the 18th century, were racial, they were stratified, they were hierarchical. And following on from Linnaeus, there was a sort of a raging academic debate amongst the sort of thinking classes, which was the monogenous versus the polygenists, which I think is what your question is about. And the monogenists believed that humans were all one species. So everyone's a biblical creationist at this point, so we're all descended from Adam and Eve, as described in Genesis. And the monogenists thought that the different physical characteristics that we see in people around the world were a result of changes as people migrated away from Eden, from the descendants of Adam and Eve. Whereas the polygenists thought that they acquired those differences in situ, in specific places. The most extreme version of polygenism was expressed by Voltaire, who thought that black African people were a different species, right? Now, both arguments are wrong, but the monogenists is more closely associated with our modern understanding of migration of people around the world. How did it relate to eugenics? I don't know that I know the answer to that. I can't think of that's much more in the domain of the sort of academic debates about scientific racism the monogenists won, and in The Descent of Man, Darwin writes, he mocks the idea that, he mocks the idea of racial essentialism by suggesting that he can't imagine any physical characteristic in any group of people is immutable and won't change over time, over generational time, which is correct. And he also mocks the idea that the essentialist idea that these are discrete characteristics. He mocks it by pointing out that of the great thinkers about scientific racism of this time, the range of the number of races is between 1 and 63. And he very clearly came down on the idea that there was one species of humans. But I don't think there's a direct link to eugenics. That's more in the domain of my previous book. Thank you, though. That was not a short answer, was it?
Yeah.
Well, I'll be as brief as possible, but it was really just to go back to what you were saying about COVID and people with Down syndrome. I have CP and I'm a wheelchair user, and I had a similar conversation with my GP at early days of the pandemic where she said, I advise you to do your best not to get COVID because I don't know that you would have the medical intervention that someone else would have. And my final bit I want to add on, because I think it's important, is the difficulty you had with euthanasia. As somebody that studied the topic quite significantly, I see eugenics and euthanasia as closely linked, and what I would ask you to think about when I say that is it could be used. I know there's many people that advocate for it, but it could be used to target vulnerable groups, particularly those with disabilities. So we're in Scotland where it's coming up again, and that's what I ask everybody to reflect on. How diverse do we want our society to be? And that should include people with diverse disabilities. Sorry for the diatribe, but I just thought it was important to add that to the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, thank you. Normally in these types of events, we don't allow statements versus questions, but I think that was absolutely justified, and thank you for saying that. The role, the targeting of people with disabilities over the history of eugenics, well, there's no worse example than in Nazi Germany, but it is something that is central to the enacted eugenics and the eugenics theorizing in countries in the UK. And people with CP were at the top of the list. So thanks.
I will take this next question from online. It said, does the relatively recent enforced adoption of babies born to unmarried mothers and against their will in the UK somehow fit into the idea of uplift?
Wow, these are good questions.
I know.
Did you write that?
I did.
Are you secretly typing them out like that? The recent, what was it?
The forced adoption of babies born to unmarried mothers.
Well, I didn't know that was happening.
Yeah.
Is that happening in the UK?
Evidently.
Huh?
It's something recent. So.
Because they're unmarried?
Yep.
Yeah, that's straight up eugenics.
Yeah, because the idea is who's fit to be the mother and who isn't.
Yeah.
Yep. Quite problematic. And you know that it's not the wealthy woman that's unmarried having a baby that they're going to force to give their child to adoption. So it's definitely an attack on a certain group. Yeah.
I mean, I don't know about that, but that is deeply, deeply problematic. And in fact, in the conversations after Roe v. Wade was turned over, like 2 months ago, whenever it was, one of the Supreme Court judges, which one was it? Was it I can't remember, but one of them was talking specifically about.
Was it Clarence Thomas?
Yeah, probably. But it was
problematic figure.
It was straight out of Gilead. It was you know, if women are having babies, that they should be a stock for middle class people to adopt babies.
Yeah.
That's
the problem.
Margaret Atwood wrote about that in the 80s, and that's a fascist state that she's describing, right?
Yeah, and I mean, it just goes to show how history repeats itself. It's not so far removed from what we're doing now.
People are terrible, aren't they?
Yeah.
I've depressed myself in this.
Well, we have one more question. I guess we only have like 20 seconds left, so if you can ask your question quickly. Yeah.
Do you want to wait for the mic?
You want to get the... Go? Yeah. Oh, they say -30.
Well, thank you. Throughout, the words "how to argue with a racist" have been directly in my line of sight. Now, you remind me, some years ago now, the former Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, was speaking at the book festival. He mentioned that out of all the countries in the world, I think it's 180 something, there are only 3 which are more than 95% monoracial. Only 3 countries which are the population is more than 95% one race. Ireland, Iceland, and Malta. Pardon to anyone, but 3 tiddlers. Now, that was some years ago. Are you able to tell us, has that data changed in those years? Is it now just 2 or none at all?
No, I'm not able to tell you that. No. Okay. It's an interesting question. I'm unsurprised about Iceland. But again, it's the third time I'm answering the question. I really don't know. But I'll find out.
Okay, thank you.
No, no problem.
Thank you, everyone. And there will be a book signing afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you.